The 11th century was a transformative period marked by significant political shifts, religious developments, military conquest, and cultural advancements across multiple regions of the world. One of the most significant events was the Norman conquest of England in 1066, led by William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. After defeating King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, William established Norman rule in England, altering its language, culture, and aristocratic structure permanently. Around the same time, the investiture controversy emerged, which was a powerful struggle between the Church and the Holy Roman Emperor, primarily Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. This dispute over the appointment of bishops symbolized the broader conflict between church and state that would shape European politics for centuries. The Catholic Church grew in influence during this period, with reform movements led by the Cluniac monks promoting piety, moral discipline, and centralized religious authority. In 1095, Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in response to the Byzantine Emperor Alexio I Komnenos, with his request for help against Muslim advances in Anatolia. The Pope's call to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control resulted in the deaths of thousands of European knights and peasants. The Crusade, which continued into the next century, resulted in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 and the establishment of several Crusader states in the Levant. This marked the beginning of centuries-long religious and military conflict between Christian and Muslim powers, deeply influencing both Western Europe and the Islamic world. Speaking of the Islamic world, the Seljuk Turks rose to power, becoming dominant in Persia and further east. After defeating the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Seljuks expanded into Anatolia, weakening Byzantine influence and opening the door for future Turkish states. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the Fatimid Caliphate held control over Egypt and parts of the Levant, representing a powerful Shia Islamic presence during this time. Asia also saw significant changes during the 11th century. In China, the Song dynasty was at its height, known for its economic prosperity, bureaucratic sophistication, and cultural achievements. The Chinese invented movable type printing during this period, a revolutionary technology that predated Gutenberg's press in Europe by centuries. Additionally, there were advances in science, mathematics, and engineering, including improved agricultural tools and the widespread use of gunpowder in warfare. In Mesoamerica, the Toltecs dominated central Mexico, serving as cultural and political predecessors to the Aztecs. In sub-Saharan Africa, the Ghana Empire reached its peak, before beginning to decline due to internal conflict and pressure from Muslim Berber invaders. From the rise of powerful monarchs to the future implementations of religious influence over government, this century helped shape the modern world. The 12th century was a time of political consolidation, religious expansion, intellectual revival, and military conflict. It was a time of both violent disruptions and cultural flourishing, defining much of the trajectory for the late Middle Ages and early modern world. In Europe, the century was heavily influenced by the ongoing Crusades. Following the success of the First Crusade at the end of the previous century, the Second Crusade was launched in 1147 after the fall of the County of Edessa, one of the Crusader states. However, it ended in failure for the Christian forces. A major figure of the century, Saladin, emerged in the Islamic world during this time. As the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, Saladin united Egypt and Syria and recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187 following the decisive Battle of Hadin. This led to the Third Crusade from 1189 to 1192, involving prominent European monarchs such as Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Although Richard and Saladin fought several key battles, the crusade ultimately failed to recapture Jerusalem, though a treaty allowed Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City. In Western Europe, powerful monarchies began to solidify. England saw the development of legal and administrative systems under Henry II, including the establishment of common law. The conflict between Henry and Archbishop Thomas Becket, which culminated in Becket's death in 1170, symbolized the tensions between secular rules and the Church. France under Louis VI and Louis VII expanded royal authority, while the Holy Roman Empire remained fractured under the rule of Frederick Barbarossa, who struggled to assert control over Italy and the Church. The 12th century also saw the flourishing of the Islamic Golden Age in many regions, specifically under the Seljuk Turks and later Saladin's Ayyubid dynasty. In Al-Andalus, which is now modern-day Spain, Cities like Cordoba and Toledo remained intellectual centers, where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars translated ancient Greek and Arabic texts into Latin. The knowledge that was learned helped spark the 12th century Renaissance in Europe, a period marked by renewed interest in classical philosophy, science, and logic. The establishment of universities in places such as in Bologna and Paris reflected the growing importance of education and theological debate. In Asia, the Song dynasty in China continued to thrive, specifically in the Southern Song period after losing northern territory to the Jurchen-led Jin dynasty. Chinese innovation remained strong, with developments in shipbuilding, navigation tools like the magnetic compass, and the refinement of printing technology. Meanwhile, Japan entered the late Heian period, with power increasingly shifting from the imperial court to emerging warrior clans, foreshadowing the rise of the samurai class. The 12th century was also marked by architectural and cultural achievements, specifically in Europe with the emergence of Gothic architecture seen in the construction of grand cathedrals like Notre Dame de Paris. The combination of religious authority and intellectual revival defined this period as a bridge between the early and high Middle Ages. The 13th century was one of the most dynamic and transformative periods in global history. This century saw empires expand and collapse, cities flourish and burn, and ideas travel further and faster than ever before. Perhaps the most defining event of the 13th century was the rise of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan. In 1206, he united the Mongol tribes and launched one of the most successful and brutal military expansions in history. The Mongols conquered vast lands in Asia, including China, Central Asia, Persia, and Eastern Europe. Genghis Khan and his successors, such as Ogedei and Kublai Khan, created the largest land empire in history. The Mongols were known for their military skill and ruthlessness, but they also facilitated trade and communication across Eurasia, reviving the Silk Road and allowing for unprecedented cross-cultural exchange. Under Kublai Khan, the Mongols established the Yuan dynasty in China in 1271, marking the first time China was ruled by non-Han emperors. In Europe, the 13th century saw increasing power of monarchies and the Catholic Church. In France, King Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis, strengthened royal justice and led 2 crusades, though both ended in failure. In England, tensions between the monarchy and the nobility culminated in the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215 by King John, laying early foundations for constitutional governance. The Holy Roman Empire struggled with internal divisions, and the Church reached its peak influence under popes like Innocent III, who expanded religious authority and intervened in European political affairs. The Crusades continued into the 13th century, specifically the 5th through 8th Crusades, but most were unsuccessful. The Fourth Crusade in 1202, which diverted from its original mission, infamously ended in the sack of Constantinople, severely weakening the Byzantine Empire and deepening the divide between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Later crusades, including those in the Baltic region and against heretical groups like the Cathars in southern France, expanded the idea of holy war beyond the Holy Land. In Asia, the Song dynasty in China fell to the Mongols in 1279, officially ending a native Chinese dynasty until the Ming. In the Islamic world, the once powerful Abbasid Caliphate was devastated when the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, a major blow to Islamic culture and learning. Meanwhile, the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt rose to prominence after defeating the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, halting their westward advance. Technological and intellectual advances also defined the century. Eyeglasses were invented in Italy, and mechanical clocks began to appear in Europe. The 13th century also saw the rise of scholasticism in Europe, led by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, who attempted to reconcile faith with reason. Overall, the 13th century was an era of empire building, intellectual awakening, and cultural exchange. The 14th century was a time of both crisis and transformation in many regions of the world. The most devastating event of the 14th century was the Black Death, a massive pandemic that swept through Europe, Asia, and North Africa between 1347 and 1351. Originating likely in Central Asia, the plague spread through trade routes, specifically the Silk Road, and maritime paths, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people worldwide, with Europe losing up to 1/3 of its population. The social and economic consequences were immense. As labor shortages shifted power toward peasants and workers, feudal systems began to weaken, and widespread death led to cultural and religious anxiety, reshaping views on life and mortality. Another brutally defining feature of this century was war. The 100 Years' War between England and France began in 1337 and continued for over a century. It was rooted in disputes over territory and claims to the French throne. Notable figures emerged during this time, such as Edward III of England and Philip VI of France. The war featured key military developments, including the increased use of longbows by the English, which led to notable victories at battles like Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers a decade later. This conflict also destabilized both kingdoms internally and marked the decline of traditional chivalric warfare. In Italy and parts of Europe, the early stages of the Renaissance began to emerge. Thinkers and artists began reviving classical texts and ideas, laying the intellectual foundations for a cultural rebirth. Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, was a key figure in this movement. In the Islamic world, the once dominant Mongol Khanate in Persia collapsed by the mid-14th century, and the Mamluks in Egypt maintained their power. In Central Asia, the fearsome conqueror Tamerlane, also known as Timur, began his rise to power near the end of the century. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Turks began to rise as a major power, capturing territories in the Balkans and posing an increasing threat to the weakened Byzantine Empire. China was ruled by the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty until its collapse in 1368, replaced by the native Ming dynasty, founded by Zhu Yinzhong, who rose from a peasant background to become Emperor Hongwu. The fall of the Yuan was due to internal corruption, natural disasters, and uprisings fueled by famine and discontent. The 14th century was defined by catastrophe, but also transformation. The pandemic, wars, and shifting powers created immense suffering, but they also disrupted old systems, sparked new ideas, and marked the end of the medieval world order. It was a time of both endings and beginnings, shaping the course of global history. The 15th century was a time of profound transformation across the globe. It marked the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the early modern era. One of the most defining events of the century was the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks under Sultan Mehmed II. This event ended the Byzantine Empire, a 1,000-year remnant of the Roman Empire, and marked the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a dominant power in both Europe and the Islamic world. The Ottomans continued to expand into southeastern Europe, threatening Christian kingdoms and reshaping the political balance of the region. The fall of Constantinople also accelerated the migration of Greek scholars to Western Europe, bringing with them ancient texts that helped fuel the Renaissance. In Western Europe, the Renaissance reached new heights. Originating in Italy, this intellectual and artistic movement emphasized a revival of classical learning, humanism, and individualism. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and thinkers like Lorenzo Valla began producing works that challenged medieval norms and celebrated human creativity and reason. Wealthy patrons, such as the Medici family in Florence, supported this cultural flourishing. Meanwhile, the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 revolutionized the spread of information. Movable type allowed for the mass production of books, dramatically increasing literacy and the transfer of ideas. This invention not only advanced the Renaissance, but also laid the groundwork for future movements, such as the Protestant Reformation. In the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal began their rise to global power. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 unified Spain, and their reign culminated in the completion of the Reconquista in 1492 with the conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. That same year, they sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic, leading to the European discovery of the Americas and initiating the Age of Exploration. Portugal, under Prince Henry the Navigator, led early voyages along the African coast, setting the stage for global maritime empires. In Asia, the Ming dynasty solidified its control over China, promoting internal stability and launching major naval expeditions under Admiral Zhang He. Between 1405 and 1433, Zhang He led massive fleets to Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and East Africa, showcasing Chinese power and fostering trade relations. However, after these voyages, the Ming government turned inward, ending China's period of maritime exploration. In the Americas, the Aztec Empire rose to dominance in central Mexico under rulers like Moctezuma I, and the Inca Empire expanded across the Andes in South America. Both civilizations achieved remarkable cultural and architectural feats. The 15th century was defined by exploration, innovation, and rebirth, and it saw the fall of ancient empires and the rise of new powers, the birth of global trade routes, and a cultural awakening that would shape the modern world. The 16th century was one of the most transformative centuries in world history. Beginning with the European discovery of the Americas, Christopher Columbus's voyage in the previous decade had opened the door for Spanish and Portuguese exploration. Spain quickly emerged as a dominant global power, and conquistadors such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro conquered the mighty Aztec and Inca empires, bringing immense wealth and devastating diseases to the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade also began to take shape, forcibly transporting millions of Africans to the New World over the next several centuries. Portugal established a sea route to India and built a powerful trading empire stretching from Africa to Southeast Asia. One of the most important events of the 16th century was the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg, criticizing the Catholic Church's corruption and sale of indulgences. This act ignited a religious revolution across Europe, and Protestantism spread rapidly, especially in Northern Europe, leading to decades of religious wars, persecutions, and political realignments. In response, the Catholic Church initiated the Counter-Reformation, aiming to reform internally and reaffirm its doctrines. Monarchs played a crucial role in shaping this century, with Charles V ruling a vast Habsburg Empire including Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Americas. His son, Philip II of Spain, presided over the Spanish Golden Age and also saw military overreach, including the failed Spanish Armada against England in 1588. In England, Henry VIII's split from the Catholic Church led to the formation of the Church of England, further intensifying religious divisions. His daughter, Elizabeth I, reigned for most of the latter half of the century, defeating the Armada and overseeing a cultural golden age, including the works of William Shakespeare. In Asia, the Mughal Empire rose to power in India and reached its height under Akbar the Great, known for his military conquest, administrative reforms, and religious tolerance. In China, the Ming dynasty remained stable and prosperous, focusing on internal development. Japan, meanwhile, entered a period of near-constant warfare known as the Sengoku period, a time of rival warlords and shifting alliances, leading eventually to the unification of Japan by Tokugawa Ieyasu at the century's end. Technological and scientific advancements also defined this century, and the scientific revolution began to take shape with figures like Copernicus, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system in 1543. This idea would challenge centuries of accepted thought and pave the way for future discoveries. The 16th century was a turning point in world history. It was a century of conquest, colonization, discovery, and debate. The world became more interconnected than ever, and the seeds of modern civilization were firmly planted. The 17th century was a turbulent and transformative period that reshaped the political, scientific, and cultural landscape of the world. In Europe, religious and political tensions erupted into several major conflicts. The most devastating was the 30 Years' War, beginning in 1618, and this was a brutal conflict primarily within the Holy Roman Empire that involved many European powers. It began as a struggle between Catholic and Protestant states, but evolved into a broader political battle for dominance. The war devastated Central Europe, killing millions and crippling entire regions. It ended with the Peace of Westphalia, which redrew borders, established principles of national sovereignty, marked the beginning of the modern state system. England experienced its own internal conflicts. During the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651, a struggle between King Charles I and Parliament. This conflict ended in the king's execution and the brief establishment of a republic under Oliver Cromwell. Although the monarchy was restored in 1660, the war set the stage for future constitutional changes and the eventual rise of parliamentary democracy. Meanwhile, the scientific revolution transformed how people understood the world. Building on earlier ideas, scientists like Galileo Galilei, Johannes Kepler, and Isaac Newton made groundbreaking discoveries in astronomy, physics, and mathematics. Galileo supported the heliocentric model and faced opposition from the Catholic Church, while Newton laid the foundations for classical physics. Colonial expansion accelerated throughout the 17th century, with European powers such as Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands competing for overseas territories. The Dutch East India Company and British East India Company were powerful commercial enterprises that helped establish trade dominance in Asia. Colonization of the Americas expanded rapidly, with growing settlements in North and South America leading to the exploitation and displacement of indigenous populations. The transatlantic slave trade also expanded during this century, forcibly transporting millions of Africans to the Americas. In Asia, the Mughal Empire in India reached its peak under Shah Jahan, who commissioned the construction of the Taj Mahal, but began to decline under his successor. The Qing dynasty was established in China in 1644, replacing the Ming, and would go on to rule for centuries. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate consolidated power and enforced a strict policy of isolation known as sakoku, cutting off most foreign influence for over 2 centuries. The 17th century also saw devastating plagues, famines, and climate anomalies. The Little Ice Age caused widespread crop failures and hardship, specifically in Europe and Asia, and yet amidst all this chaos, the foundations of the modern world were being laid through global exchange, scientific discovery, and political evolution. The 18th century was a transformative era marked by revolution, empire building, and innovation. At the heart of the century was the Enlightenment, a philosophical movement that emphasized reason, science, and individualism over tradition. Thinkers like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, and Immanuel Kant challenged the authority of monarchies in the church. This ideological shift would directly influence major revolutions later in the century. The American Revolution from 1775 to 1783 saw the 13 British colonies in North America break free from British rule, leading to the formation of the United States. Influenced by Enlightenment ideals, the revolution emphasized liberty, democracy, and republicanism. The French Revolution from 1789 to 1799 followed, erupting from deep economic crisis, social inequality, and resentment of the monarchy. It led to the execution of King Louis XVI, the fall of the French monarchy, and a period of extreme political instability that ultimately gave rise to Napoleon Bonaparte. His military and political dominance reshaped Europe at the century's close and into the next. In addition to revolutions, global conflict defined this century. The 7 Years' War, beginning in 1756, was a global conflict involving most European powers, affecting Europe, North America, Africa, and Asia. It is often referred to as the quote-unquote First World War, and resulted in a shift of colonial power, with Britain emerging as the dominant global empire, specifically under expelling France from much of North Africa and India. Simultaneously, the transatlantic slave trade reached its peak, with millions of Africans forcibly transported to the Americas under brutal conditions, fueling the plantation economies of European empires. Asia experienced significant developments as well, as in China, the Qing dynasty reached the height of its power under emperors like Kangxi and Qianlong, expanding its territory and cultural influence. In India, the Mughal Empire was in decline, paving the way for increased British control through the East India Company. Japan remained largely isolated under the Tokugawa shogunate, focusing on internal peace and cultural growth. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire struggled with internal stagnation and external threats, gradually losing ground to European powers. Important inventions and scientific advancements also characterized the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the latter part of the century, with innovations like the steam engine, spinning jenny, and power loom revolutionizing manufacturing and labor. These changes made a massive shift from agrarian economies to industrial societies. Advances in medicine, such as Edward Jenner's development of the smallpox vaccine in 1796, marked the beginning of modern immunology. The 18th century was an age where new ideologies were born, and the foundations of the modern world were laid. The 19th century was a time of immense transformation across the globe. It was defined by the Industrial Revolution, imperial expansion, nationalist movements, social reform, and remarkable scientific and technological progress. The century began with the rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose military campaigns redrew the map of Europe and spread the revolutionary ideals of liberty and nationalism. After his defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the Congress of Vienna attempted to restore monarchies and balance power in Europe, but the seeds of change had already been planted. Throughout the century, the Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain in the late 18th century, spread to Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. This brought about massive production, urbanization, and vast changes in labor, transportation and daily life. Railroads, steamships, and the telegraph revolutionized communication and travel. Inventors such as Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Alexander Graham Bell transformed how people lived and worked, with innovations like the light bulb, electric power, and the telephone. The rise of industrial capitalism also led to harsh working conditions and sparked the growth of labor unions and social reform movements. Politically, the 19th century saw the rise of nationalism and the unification of several modern states. Germany was unified under Otto von Bismarck's leadership after a series of wars, while Italy also became a single nation after decades of struggle. In the Americas, many Latin American countries achieved independence from Spain and Portugal, led by figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. The United States expanded westward, driven by the ideology of manifest destiny, which led to conflict with Native American tribes in neighboring Mexico. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865, sparked by the issue of slavery and states' rights, resulted in the abolition of slavery and a more centralized federal government. The 19th century was also a time of aggressive imperialism, as European powers colonized large portions of Africa and Asia in what became known as the Scramble for Africa and the expansion of the British and French empires. The Opium Wars in China opened the country to Western influence and control, while India came under direct British rule following the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. Japan, in contrast, modernized rapidly during the Meiji Restoration, transforming from a feudal society into an industrial power by the century's end. Socially, major movements for equality began to take shape as the women's suffrage movement gained momentum, especially in Britain and the United States. Abolitionist movements across the world led to the end of the transatlantic slave trade and the emancipation of slaves in many countries. Thinkers like Karl Marx challenged capitalism and laid the groundwork for socialist and communist ideologies, which would greatly influence the following century. The 19th century was a time when the modern world, with all its complexity and global interconnectedness, truly began to take shape. The 20th century was one of the most transformative periods in human history. The century began amidst growing tensions between empires and rising nationalism. These tensions erupted into World War I from 1914 to 1918, which was a devastating global conflict that introduced mechanized warfare and caused the collapse of major empires including the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires. The Treaty of Versailles that ended the war sowed the seeds for future conflict, specifically in Germany. The interwar years were marked by social unrest, economic depression, and the rise of totalitarian regimes. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 led to the formation of the Soviet Union under Vladimir Lenin, later ruled by Joseph Stalin, who implemented brutal policies and purges. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power, leading to World War II from 1939 to 1945, with this being the deadliest conflict in human history. The war was marked by the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews and millions of others were systematically killed. It ended with the defeat of the Axis powers and the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States, showcasing the terrifying power of nuclear weapons. Following World War II, the war entered the Cold War era, a period of ideological rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. This conflict never escalated into direct war between the superpowers, but fueled numerous proxy wars, including those in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. The nuclear arms race and the threat of mutually assured destruction defined global politics for decades. Meanwhile, the world saw the collapse of colonial empires as countries across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East gained independence. Leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi in India and Nelson Mandela in South Africa became symbols of peaceful resistance and liberation. The second half of the century saw remarkable technological and scientific progress. The space race led to the first man landing on the moon in 1969, and computers, the internet, antibiotics, commercial air travel, and television revolutionized life. Major breakthroughs in civil rights occurred as well, including the American Civil Rights Movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., the fight for women's rights, and the growing visibility of LGBTQ communities. The global economy became increasingly interconnected, especially toward the end of the century with the rise of globalization. Influential figures of the 20th century included Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Mao Zedong, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Mikhail Gorbachev, and many, many more. The century ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and a shift toward liberal democracy and capitalism in many parts of the world. Despite numerous tragedies and conflicts, the 20th century was ultimately defined by progress in human rights, science, and technology, setting the stage for the interconnected digital age of the 21st century. Speaking of the 21st century, if you would like to see a part 3 where I cover every year in the 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s, leave a like and subscribe. Comment down below your thoughts on any of the centuries I discussed in this video, and check out part 1 if you haven't already. Thank you very much, and goodbye.